They shared prayers in the same chapel. Passed each other notes during synods. Laughed, softly, behind Vatican doors the world would never see. One led with fire. The other, with tears. Both were trusted to shape the soul of the Church. But now, that brotherhood has shattered like stained glass under pressure. Pope Leo XIV has done the unthinkable, he has removed Cardinal Tagle. No warning. No farewell. Just a sealed letter, and silence. But was it betrayal? Or something far more divine? Before we begin, comment where you're watching from, because what follows will shake your understanding of power, loyalty, and spiritual truth. Before they were divided. They were disciples. Pope Leo XIV, once known as Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, was not born into power. He rose through the margins, walking with the broken in forgotten villages. His hands baptized the dying. His robes collected the dust of poverty. He rarely spoke in debates, but when he did, the room fell still. He carried mystery, and mercy. And the weight of every vow he ever made. Across from him stood Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. Bright-eyed. Luminous. A scholar in Rome, a servant in Manila, a voice for the misunderstood. Where Leo spoke with silence, Tagle spoke with tears. Where Leo stood still, Tagle stepped forward. They were two halves of a sacred tension, tradition and transformation. And for a time, the Church rejoiced. Because rarely do fire and water walk in harmony. But the harmony wasn't meant to last. Beneath their shared smiles. A question festered in the sacred halls, who truly speaks for the soul of the Church? Was it the one who guarded the walls? Or the one who opened the doors? At first, it was only whispers. Then theological papers. Then pastoral letters, written with careful words, but sharp implications. It wasn't rebellion. Not yet. But it was a quiet departure. Subscribe to faith-hidden stories, not for content. But for truth the world often hides behind incense and ceremony. Still won't? Then tell us in the comments, what are you afraid we'll reveal next, the truth about them, or the truth about yourself? It began with a footnote. A single line in a draft document from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Cardinal Tagle had suggested language that, in his words, would acknowledge the wounds of the world without diluting the truths of heaven. A bridge, he called it. Pope Leo XIV, then newly elected, read the line in silence. He closed the folder. Then looked out the window of his study for several minutes, watching pigeons gather near the obelisk in St. Peter's Square. He made no correction. But he made a note. To Tagle, it was dialogue. To Leo, it was deviation. Their meetings grew longer, but colder. They no longer spoke as brothers. They deliberated as diplomats, each defending a corner of the soul. Tagle spoke of the poor, the unheard, the excluded. He referenced field hospitals and a church without locked doors. Leo replied with parables, of narrow gates and wandering sheep, who must be led, not left. They were not arguing. They were interpreting eternity. And in every synod and council, their tones remained respectful. But the space between their seats seemed to widen, inch by inch, word by word. The Vatican press corps began to whisper, not about what they said, but about the looks exchanged when one rose to speak and the other bowed his head. Then came the closed-door synod on ecclesial identity. Votes were cast. The room split. And afterward, a memo was drafted. Tagle refused to sign. He didn't tear it. He didn't protest. He simply laid his pen on the table, and said, "I cannot speak for the Church if I am not allowed to speak to her wounds." Leo said nothing in return. But he never asked Tagle to attend another private briefing again. Before you defend Leo, or rush to Tagle's side, subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. This isn't fiction. This is what they didn't expect you to hear. Still won't? Then write it in the comments, what part of this truth hurts you the most, and why. It wasn't doctrine, not at first. It was a humanitarian directive, simple, even obvious, to the untrained eye. An initiative aimed at dioceses in conflict zones, where war and poverty blurred the lines between morality and survival. Cardinal Tagle drafted a clause. A single paragraph, suggesting that priests in those regions be given pastoral freedom, to meet souls where they are, even if those souls did not conform to the full rhythm of Rome. He did not call for change. He called for mercy. But mercy, without guardrails, can look a lot like rebellion. The clause arrived on Pope Leo's desk late on a Friday evening. He read it once. Then again. Slowly. Deliberately. The firelight flickered against his white cassock, casting a long shadow on the Vatican floor. He made no public statement. No condemnation. Just 2 handwritten words in the margin, not yet. But then. Cardinal Tagle published his reasoning. Not in a political forum. Not in protest. In a theological journal, read mostly by seminarians and scholars. He spoke not as a revolutionary, but as a shepherd aching for his flock. We are not excusing sin, he wrote. We are refusing to abandon the sinner. There were no names. No accusations. But everyone knew who had said, not yet. Everyone knew what had just begun. To Pope Leo, it wasn't a challenge. It was something more dangerous, a breach in tone. Not heresy. But the aroma of disobedience. They met the next day. No aides. No transcript. Just 2 chairs. A crucifix. And decades of unspoken hope between them. Tagle came with tears in his eyes. Leo did not offer a hug. The walls heard no shouting. Only long silences, and breath held too long. When they emerged, both men looked older. And for the first time in years, neither of them smiled. If you believe disagreement isn't betrayal, subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories now. This moment matters. If not, explain in the comments, is silence the price of faithfulness, or the burden of the faithful? It was a Tuesday. The basilica lights had dimmed, but the world was watching. Thousands of bishops, cardinals, and theologians tuned into the live synodal broadcast, each screen flickering with the face of the Church's most silent reformer, Pope Leo XIV. He sat upright. Calm. No papers in hand. No prepared text. Just memory, and conviction. We live in a time where mercy is celebrated, he began. But we must guard mercy from becoming confusion. He paused, longer than usual. Eyes steady. Voice low, but unshakable. Clarity is not cruelty. And applause is not always alignment with heaven. We cannot lead souls by echoing their desires. We must lead by echoing God's. The screen split for a moment. Cardinal Tagle, seated 3 rows behind, lowered his gaze. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. But the quiet in his chest turned into a funeral bell. He looked down not out of shame, but because he recognized the tone. It was final. And it was personal. Hours later, when the basilica emptied and the marble floors echoed with lonely footsteps, a courier slipped a sealed envelope beneath the carved oak door of Tagle's residence. It bore the papal insignia, pressed in red wax. No public decree. No ceremony. Just a letter, and a line that bled like scripture, you are relieved, with blessing, but not with agreement. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. He sat in silence for nearly an hour. The letter lay open on the edge of his desk, trembling in the wind from a nearby window. He whispered only 4 words. Not with anger. Not even sorrow. Only resignation, and release. "It is done," he said. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's tolled. But no one knew what had just ended. Except the two men who had once walked side by side. If that line shook you, with blessing, but not with agreement, then subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. Not for drama, but for discernment. If it didn't, then tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were Tagle? There was no thunder. No expulsion, no decree carved in Latin, no ceremonial removal read beneath the dome. Only absence. Cardinal Tagle's office was emptied overnight. His portrait taken down. His aides reassigned. The Vatican calendar no longer bore his initials beside key meetings. And yet, no one dared say the word, dismissal. They called it, a relocation. A spiritual retreat. A strategic reassignment. A phrase for every heart unwilling to admit what had just happened in silence. But truth needs no microphone. It only needs a man who refuses to lie. 3 days later, Pope Leo stood before the College of Cardinals, his voice calm, his mitre casting a long shadow across the marble. There are moments when leadership requires listening, he began. And others, when it demands standing alone. He did not raise his voice. He did not strike out with names. But every man in that chamber felt the ground tilt. We must not confuse pastoral sensitivity with spiritual surrender, he said. Leadership must reflect heaven, not trends. A shepherd must not fear to lose popularity, if it means saving the soul of his flock. No one dared applaud. Not yet. But in the press room, editors were already typing. The headlines didn't need confirmation. They already knew the name that was missing from the next conclave briefing. Tagle. One cardinal whispered to another, not in criticism, but in awe, he did it. He removed him without ever saying his name. And still, there was no anger. No victory. No celebration. Just clarity. Clarity cold enough to chill the skin. And pure enough to silence every room it entered. If you believe courage is lonely, subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories. Not for noise. But for the echoes of truth history tries to bury. Still won't? Then tell us in the comments, which would you choose, peace or position? That night, the basilica stood in shadows. Even the marble seemed to breathe slower, as if the very stones beneath St. Peter's bones knew something had shifted in the air. Pope Leo did not summon guards. He did not request his secretaries. He went alone. Through the echoing halls of the apostolic palace. Down the steps worn by saints and sinners alike. To a private chapel carved in solemn stillness. There, beneath a crucifix older than kingdoms, he knelt. No robes. No throne. Just a man, and his silence. He lit a single candle. The flame danced like a heartbeat, fragile, flickering, alive. And as the faint glow trembled against the icon of the suffering Christ, Leo bowed his head, not in power, but in penance. He whispered a prayer. Only the angels heard it whole. But the cameras, watching from a respectful distance, caught the motion of his lips. 2 words. Barely audible. But undeniable, forgive me, brother. Not because he regretted the decision. But because leadership, true leadership, must carry sorrow, not just authority. He did not remove Tagle out of anger. He did not silence him for pride. He made the hardest choice a shepherd can make, to wound a friend, in order to guard a flock. To disappoint the world, in order to remain faithful to heaven. This wasn't vengeance. It was conviction. But conviction always comes at a price. Subscribe if you believe in leaders who cry in silence, not just speak in storms. The world doesn't need louder leaders. It needs deeper ones. If not, tell us in the comments, what kind of leader do you still pray for, and would you still follow them, if they wept behind closed doors? What would you have said, if you were in that room? Not the grand chamber. Not the press briefings. But that quiet space, where Leo sat with the letter still in his hands, and Tagle stared at the candlelight like it might explain the pain in his chest. Would you have spoken? Or stayed silent? Would you defend friendship, or protect the flock? Would you kneel before the memory of what was, or rise for what still must be? These are not questions for theologians. They are not reserved for cassocks and collars. They are questions for every soul that's ever had to choose between being loved, and being right. Between keeping peace, and keeping faith. Because in the end, every leader bleeds. Every friend leaves a wound. And every truth, if it's real, will eventually cost you something. So listen carefully, not to the noise of debate, but to the silence that followed the decision. There. You'll hear the sound of a church still wrestling with its heart. May we all seek truth with humble hearts, and never confuse mercy with compromise. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories, not for entertainment, but for the convictions you're still afraid to voice. Still won't? Then type it in the comments. What truth are you still resisting, just because it costs too much?